As members of Friends of Glasgow Royal Infirmary, we have been asked to give you a small, unexpurgated account of events and development of cardiology in the Royal. And we are here to talk about some of the highs, but possibly some of the lows as well, because a lot of things happen in the life of a hospital. Now, my name is Ross Lorimer, and I started here as a medical student in 1957, and I finished my career as consultant physician and cardiologist when I retired in 2001. And my colleagues here today are Peter Macfarlane, who has actually been a member of the staff in the Royal Infirmary for 58 years. The reason for that length of time is that he doesn't seem to have a home to go to, but he's doing his best, and that's untrue.
Thank you.
John Stuart, trained in the Royal Infirmary, worked as a staff nurse in coronary care for many years, and retired in 2021 as chief nurse of the whole institution. We're going to talk about the events that we remember in our time in cardiology in the Royal, but we have also to remember that there's a history of cardiology before us, because of the Royal Infirmary was founded in 1794, and in 1812 Alan Burns wrote out a textbook on diseases of the heart and circulation, and talked about those who have served in the Royal Infirmary. He also worked for a while in the service of the Empress of Russia, Empress Catherine of Russia. He was not her personal physician, but he was employed in a hospital, and he came back to Glasgow to help his brother. His brother was Professor of Anatomy and Surgery and had been entangled in the body snatching practices at that time. And so his brother came back from Russia to help to control this, and went on to be a very eminent cardiologist at that time. Indeed, he was the first person, as far as I know, to suggest that resuscitation was possible by means of passing the electric shock through the heart. There were other important people. Sir Charles Tennant-Gairdner was Professor of Medicine here, and then went to be the Chief Medical Officer of Glasgow, the very first one. And he brought out the term systole and diastole for the cardiac cycle, and he also generated the term lugged up for cardiac sounds, which of course persists today. And John Marshall Cowan was very involved in venous pressure tracings. He was physician to 3 kings. He served in the Boer War. He took a party of medical students out to South Africa as medical assistants at that time. He was abroad in the Great War, and also was an honorary colonel in the 39-45 war. So we are going today to discuss some of the events, and we're starting mainly in 1948. In 1948, the health service was in its very early embryonic stages, and a Dr. G.H. Wright was appointed physician in charge of wards 6 and 7. Now, at that time, the Royal Infirmary had 5 medical units, and these could be described essentially as 5 cottage hospitals, because there was very little communication between the units. Each was an entity in itself. But Dr. Wright recognised that in addition to general medicine, there was a coming of specialisation. And so with the coming of specialisation and his interest in cardiology, and with the very early stages of electrocardiography, he developed a specialty in wards 6 and 7, and also in Ward B3 in Eastern District Hospital, or Juxie Hospital as we called it. And he was also associated with the early days of investigation for cardiac surgery. Mitral valve disease as a consequence of rheumatic fever was a major problem, especially a problem in young women. And many young women were unable to have children because of the severity of their heart disease, and the coming of investigation by right heart catheterization to measure pressures and gradients, and the advent of cardiac surgery, closed mitral valvotomy, allowed cardiology to develop and go forward. And at that time, it was congenital heart disease and rheumatic heart disease. Coronary heart disease was a pretty insurmountable problem. And it was only later years that we began to be interested in that. And so in 1966, Professor Veitch Laurie was appointed the first Walton Professor of Cardiology in the Royal Infirmary. And at that time, things beginning to change very rapidly, and coronary artery disease was becoming a major focus of interest. And thanks to the work of Desmond Julie in Australia and then in Edinburgh, coronary care units became established. And the first coronary care unit was in Ward 7, which had first 4 beds on the left-hand side of the ward, monitored and devoted to cardiology. And eventually, Ward 7 became totally a coronary care unit, and Ward 16 was an aftercare unit. And John spent a lot of his time in coronary care, and he can tell us about his nursing experiences.
Okay, thanks. So every day's a school day. I didn't know the half of that, Ross. So an education for me. I should start with saying I feel a wee bit underdressed because I didn't get the memo about the ties, but yeah.
I just thought you would know about that.
So I started my nurse training in the Royal Infirmary in 1982, and I completed it in 1985, and I took up a staffing post. One of the wards that you mentioned, Ward 6, which at the time was medical receiving, and then after about 6 months, I went down to Ward 5, which was the diabetic unit. And some of the players down there, Ken Patterson was one of the consultants, Professor Lawson, and Angus McCoosh, I think.
That's right.
That's right.
Came from Harris.
So that's correct. Yep. So back in the day, male nurses would go away and do psychiatry, and their female colleagues would go and do their midders, and that's exactly what happened in my case. So I left the Royal Infirmary in 1986 to go to Gartnavel Royal and do my psychiatry, and following my RMN training, I returned to the Royal Infirmary with the sole intention of going back to medical receiving Ward 6 as a staff nurse. I was interviewed by, you might remember, Jean Fleming, later Jean Smith as the nursing officer, who said that I'd be better off going to coronary care. The coronary care was an area that I'd never even been in, let alone nursed in it. So I started in 1987 as a staff nurse in coronary care. There's quite a few. It was one of the areas where you had several sisters or charge nurses. At the time, Gordon Halliburton was one of the charge nurses. Maggie Dugan, sister. Anne-Marie Callahan was a sister. And there was a few others. I can safely say, in hand and heart, of all the posts that I had throughout my nursing career, my staffing post in Ward 7 was the best and the most memorable and the most enjoyable. There was tremendous camaraderie, absolutely, a team. We would socialise ourselves. We would. I remember even going down to Ross Priory and going on a summer trip there with the unit down to play rounders and things. And probably that was one of the only units that did something like that. Such was the camaraderie.
I may say, John, on that occasion I was there, and because I was so senior to the rest of you, you brought down a Zimmer for me to do the outfield. I hope it was just a gesture.
Nothing to the fact that you ended up inebriated, but that's another story. So in coronary care, once I had mastered some of the procedures and whatever, which were all new to me. So we were doing Swan-Ganz monitoring, as you know. You
better tell people what Swan-Ganz monitoring was.
I better not. It's I think I used to call it just hemodynamic monitoring.
What did you measure?
Is this a test? The pressure, pressure in the heart. Yeah. So I think we would set up for Swan-Ganz. We'd do the monitoring. We would do internal pacing wires. And then towards the end of the 80s, we were actually doing EP studies, electrophysiology studies in the cubicles. I remember, I think, was Mark Watt one of your team?
Mark Watts, Dr. Mark Watts, yes.
Mark was down with his team.
He was from clinical physics,
right.
Regional Department of Clinical Physics.
And those procedures, from memory, would take the best part of at least half a day sometimes. By the time you get set up and you do the procedures. So we would work between, as you mentioned, Ross, between 7 which was then an 8-bedded unit, and it had Hewlett-Packard monitoring system. And then there was the flow through to Ward 16, which again from memory was a 9-bedded unit, and the staff would rotate between 7 and 16. So lots of happy memories of time in coronary care, and then from coronary care, the experience of coronary care really set me up for a charge nurse post along the corridor in Ward 6. So I actually found myself back in medical receiving. So happy memories, and some of the personalities were strong personalities throughout that time.
Peter, you, thank you, we'll come back to you.
Sure.
Peter, you were an observer of this because you were starting your studies on computer interpreter of ECGs. But as coming in and observing the unit, what were your impressions of cardiology in those days?
Dearie me, impressions of cardiology. Well, I was excited to be taking up a research post in a hospital.
I should say Peter was a mathematician and brought a very much needed intellectual rigour to the department.
No, I don't think so. I taught everybody about how to support Ayr United and football clubs, good football clubs like that. But I came in, as you've hinted at, in 1964 to look at automated interpretation of ECGs. Professor Laurie, who was Dr. Laurie at that time, had read about the use of computers for ECG interpretation, and that was really work done in Washington, D.C. by two different groups, competing groups in different ways because they used different positioning of electrodes on the chest. The one problem when I started was absolutely no equipment. So I came here with a pencil and paper to help me get going. Obviously, I had to do a great deal of reading on the medical side of things, and electrocardiographic side of things. I can remember even Saturday mornings were the unit meetings, everybody shirt, tie, yes, and white coats, 10:30 on a Saturday morning to do the case reviews and so on. So these were interesting and exciting early days. Dr. Laurie obtained funds for me to go to America and have a look at what was happening there. And eventually we got going really through a grant from the British Heart Foundation. And that was due to late Lord Fraser. I'm not sure anybody will remember him, but House of Fraser people will still know about the House of Fraser shops. So we had a grant then of about £4,000, which was a huge amount of money in the mid to late 1960s. And that allowed us to have a small laboratory computer. In addition to that, we had a rather large tape recorder and so on, an amplifier. So the recording equipment in the early days was huge. Unfortunately, I remember one day we had finished most of the early research work, and Arlene Kelly, I think it was, pulled the tape recorder out of its rack just a little bit too far, and the whole machine equipment fell over, and that was the end of the large tape recorder. But ultimately, through using the computer at the university, the KDF9 computer, which in those days was like half a football pitch, or a penalty, at least the penalty area of a football pitch, in the basement of the chemistry building, we did our early analysis there. And then came back, and with the help of others in the group which had expanded, we transformed the program into another language that could run on a laboratory computer. And by 1971, I think it was, we had the earliest hospital system worldwide, we believe, small computer system for automated reporting of ECGs. And we worked to enhance that through the 70s. We added analysis of heart rhythm, which is very important, of course. We added analysis of changes from day to day after a heart attack, that kind of change. Unfortunately, though, most of this was based on using what was called a 3-lead ECG, whereas the cardiologists and the physicians wanted the standard 12-lead ECG. So by 1979, Scottish Office organised a conference, in-house conference, and said they would fund us to carry on if we switched to using the 12-lead ECG. We did that successfully. And in the early 1980s, the new extension to the Royal Infirmary was due to be opened shortly thereafter. And people from Siemens Elima in Sweden came to the hospital to make an offer tender for cardiac catheterization lab. And in passing, the salesman had a look at what we were doing, and he saw our automated analysis system and said, we need to have this. So that was 1981. There was an agreement between the university and Siemens Elima in Stockholm to adopt our software and put it into their commercial system. Now, in 1981, the university had nobody interested in commercialization of equipment. And they had to bring in a consultant from outside to advise on how to set up a contract with a commercial company. That may be hard to believe, but thereafter, the program has been licensed to over 20 companies worldwide. And we believe that perhaps the order of 25 million ECGs are reported annually using the University of Glasgow software for ECG interpretation.
We'll come back to that. Now, tell me some of your stories about coronary care.
Well, I suppose we're on camera, so there's only a few that I can tell you that would be appropriate. But what one springs to mind, you probably remember, Ross, there was a Tasmanian registrar called Randall Hendricks.
How could you forget him?
That's right. And he was a great guy. And before I go on, there was quite a few characters within the registrar cohort. So Maurice Pye and Keith Oldroyd were key parts of the team, and they were heavily involved in the ISIS studies, 2 and 3 in particular. But back in the day, probably the late 80s, early 90s, we started to fit the internal defibrillators. And the original pathway, if you would want to call it that, was our patients would go over to Ward 65, which was cardiothoracic, and the thoracic surgeons would insert the AICDs, it was known, and they would have a recovery period within coronary care, and then they would be discharged via Ward 16. That was the kind of pathway. And one of the early patients I'll never forget was a chap who was a swimming attendant in Dundee, and he had come down and he had we put in this AICD, and he had been successfully discharged back to Dundee. And the story goes that Randall Hendricks was on of a Sunday, and if you remember, the registrar's room was just outside coronary care. Just as you come in, the fire doors in the right hand side, they had a wee room, and they would stay in there, and if you needed anything, you would just pop out and pull them in.
That was 24-hour cover. There was a medical presence there all the time.
That's correct.
That's
yep.
right.
And just along from it, there was the bedroom, so there was a kind of an office type area.
7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
You bet. And so Randall's in there of a Sunday, which is kind of not much happening, and it's everybody's sitting round about the station, not much happening at coronary care. And they got a phone call from the wife of the chap who had the AICD fitted, now recovering in Dundee, to say the AICD was letting off an alarm, an intermittent alarm. So we went through and get Randall, and this is pre-internet days, so we frantically, we'll phone you back, looked at the hard copy literature that we had around the AICD, couldn't find anything. But the view was that we'd asked him, had he been fine? He had been fine. Was he aware of the defibrillator shocking? No, I wasn't aware of any of that. So there was a view that for whatever reason the battery could be draining, and this could be the alarm that the battery's gone off or whatever. So anyway, we Randall decided the safest thing would be get the chap in a blue light, get Scottish Ambulance organised, bring him down here, and we can look at it. Hopefully on the Monday if everything goes to plan, because again, no hellish much happening of a Sunday. So lo and behold, we arranged for the SAS, Scottish Ambulance, to pick the chap up and blue light him down to Glasgow. And the chap's no sooner out the front door, and his wife phones the unit again to say, Mr So-and-so's in the ambulance, but I've still got the noise, this intermittent alarm. And it turned out to be the smoke alarm. A battery had gone in the house smoke alarm, and it was letting off an intermittent thing, and they panicked and thought it was coming from the AICD. So quickly in touch with the Scottish Ambulance Service to reroute and take the chap back to Dundee.
It's a good story.
Your comment about batteries and pacemakers reminds me of one of the strangest ECGs which I ever recorded. I was asked to come in to the hospital on a Saturday morning, this is the late 1960s, to record an ECG on a patient who had been dead for 24 hours. The reason for this was that this was the patient had one of the earliest pacemakers to be inserted, certainly in the Glasgow area. And the Regional Department of Clinical Physics were keen to know whether the pacemaker had been faulty and that was the cause of death. So I connected up the limb leads to the patient and then turned on the ECG machine. And believe it or not, the stylus flicked back and forwards about 60 times per minute. And so the pacemaker was working. There was, of course, no cardiac electrical activity, but we showed that the pacemaker was indeed still functioning.
And I remember in the very early days of coronary care, that my good friend and colleague John Kennedy, who's a great guy, he was taking a history of a patient admitted with a recent infarct, and he was asking the appropriate questions. When did the pain start? How long was it last? Where did it go? When the man had a cardiac arrest. So John put his pencil down, picked up the defibrillator, defibrillated the man, waited a minute and then said, "As you were saying." And we went on with his interviews. And we also, a very delightful surgeon we had here, Ian McLennan, who developed chest pain in outskirts of Edinburgh. Well, under no circumstances was he going to hospital in Edinburgh, so he drove back, came to the coronary care unit and was put to bed. And he said, "Nurse, this bed is very hard." And the nurse said to him, "Yes, Mr. McLennan, that's so we can resuscitate you more easily when your heart stops." So that took care of that too.
I remember, I mentioned Gordon Halliburton, so my lasting memory of Gordon was when I started in my first shift. Gordon was showing me around about the unit, and if you remember, it was a Hewlett-Packard system with 8 different screens. And it used to let off alarms, and they called it a 3-star alarm, which was a continuous ping. So Gordon was showing me around about the unit, and it was room 1 was, as you come in the unit, was on the right hand side, and room 2, and then it went all the way down to room 6. And Gordon's speaking to me about the monitors and the layout, and lo and behold, a 3-star alarm in room 2, so you can see on the screen. Unbeknown to me at the time, I'm just a newbie, not really known. VF arrest in room 2. Now, without a word of a lie, Gordon Halliburton, as cool as a cucumber, said, "John, just come with us just for a wee minute." And he walked towards room 2. And as he walked past the station, the console, there was a portable defibrillator. And he picked it up and walked into room 2 and zapped the guy. And the guy bolted upright and let out a scream. And then he pulled the cord then for the cardiac arrest buzzer behind the bed, and then everybody came, but lo and behold, the guy had recovered. Gordon went back, put the portable defib back up, and then we proceeded to show me around about the unit. So absolutely, it's what a hero, unbelievable.
Yes, the defibrillation could be a problem. I once very nearly fibrillated a priest. The patient in the bed whose heart had stopped. I was about to defibrillate him when I realised that the priest was still giving away his last rites, and so we desisted until he had stopped that. Peter, you remember Professor Lorimer, remember the story about the monitor and the patient?
I do.
You tell the story.
Well, I may not have it exactly correct, but
I'll correct you because I was there.
You were, well, good, thank
No,
you. Keep me right. You talked earlier about 4 monitors on the left-hand side of Ward 7, but the corner bed was such that the monitor was sitting on the windowsill beside the patient. And I think the patient really was unable to withstand watching his heartbeat da-da-da-da-da regularly, and ultimately decided that he wasn't having this. So he got out of bed, got hold of the monitor, and decided to give it the heave-ho out of the window. That's as much as I would like to say. You can maybe tell me what happened to the patient.
Well, what happened actually was that this gentleman, post-infarct, he had cerebral anoxia, and he got very confused, and he was endeavouring to jump out the window, clutching his monitor. But the situation was saved by Professor Lorimer, who dashed into the ward when he heard what was happening, saw the scene, took the whole thing in at a glance, made the most incredible rugby tackle. And so the machine didn't go out, but the patient did. But,
well, rather you tell that than
no, that's actually,
than me.
No, he couldn't actually. They were actually entangled. All the leads, the patient was well out the window before the Veach lorry got to him, but the cords and the tracings were all hanging back, and he managed to get hold of the Hewlett-Packard machine. So that was the way we went. Now, we move on. Veach lorry was appointed in 1966 as Walton Professor of Cardiology, as I said. And at that time, what came along next was coronary angiography and the ability to delineate the coronary arteries to see obstructions. It was absolutely an incredible experience. So we had to be part of this. So Veach lorry arranged that John Kennedy and I would go down to London for a few days, 2 days each exactly, to learn the technique, come back. Frank Moran made the X-ray department and pulmonary function unit available to us for an afternoon or 2 a week. And Ian Hutton, Stuart Hillis, Hani Atiba all started to learn the technique, and coronary angiography became a very fundamental investigation. And a very fundamental investigation because the coronary artery bypass surgery came along. And that was a revelation in terms of the management of coronary heart disease. And so when we moved up to Ward 47, from Ward 47 to Phase 1, excellent new facilities, and we were on the same floor as cardiac surgery and had a cath lab adjacent to the cardiac surgical unit, and the liaison and cooperation with the surgeons was exemplary. It was a very interesting time. And we took part in the European coronary bypass surgery trial, because at that time, although you could operate in the heart and give it a better blood supply, and everybody thought this was a good thing, it hadn't been proved to be so. And so we were part of this study that over a period of some 5 years showed that in patients who were suitable for surgery, half random allocated to have an operation, half treated medically, that over a 5-year period there was a benefit in having coronary artery surgery. The benefits were not as great as we anticipated they would be, but they were significant. But there is still a place for medical treatment and the management of angina. And I think, Peter, at that time you were based largely up there, were you not? You were up around in Phase 1. You were in Phase 1, your laboratories were in Phase 1. And you saw all this activity going on. Yeah. But it was an interesting time. And as John said, the camaraderie between the staff was absolutely excellent. We had outings to Arran, we climbed Goat Fell, we went to Catacall, we did all sorts of things. But there was very much a unit activity, and everybody, I think, enjoyed working there.
Ross, what about coronary artery bypass grafting? Yeah, but the angioplasty came along just in between, because I remember probably in the late 80s, IH, Ian Hutton and Hani in particular were
absolutely right.
Yeah.
The coronary artery, I was coming on to that, the coronary bypass grafting, 3 grafts, 2 grafts onto the obstructed vessels, and also internal mammary artery grafting, was very successful in the management of angina. But the possibility of dilating the diseased coronary artery segment by means of a balloon catheter, and then later by means of insertion of a stent, was revolutionary. It didn't stop a lot of work still going to the surgeons, but it certainly meant that the physicians played a large part in the interventional treatment of coronary artery disease. And Ian Hutton, Hani especially, were very, very proficient and in this new procedure, and indeed it has continued to be used to this day. I mean, Hani Atiba is still working in the Golden Jubilee doing coronary angioplasty, and it made it possible for us to do something positive about coronary artery disease in terms of restoration of blood supply. And we were also better able to diagnose obstructive lesions not only by angiography but by radionuclides with the injection of an isotope. You could see the patterns of blood flow to the heart, and when the heart was stressed, you could see what areas were getting enough blood, what areas weren't, and whether or not this was reversible. So there was a huge new armamentarium of investigations available. And then, having taken part in that, and Peter will tell us, we were very heavily involved in the West of Scotland coronary prevention study. And this was a medical management of coronary heart disease. And Peter will tell us what happened there.
Well, I think round about 1989, I think it was Bristol Myers Squibb, they invited Professor Jim Shepherd and Professor Stuart Cobb to organise the WASCOP study, as you've named it. And this was a study of pravastatin in middle-aged men who had raised cholesterol but no previous heart attack, anything like that. And there were over 6,500 men recruited to the study. Half were given the statin and half were on a placebo. And they were followed annually for 5 years. They had an ECG every year, for example, and over the course of that period, I looked after 30,000 ECGs that could have been automatically interpreted, but they still had to be checked just to make sure everything was correct. And at the end of it, 1995, the results were presented at a big meeting in Los Angeles, American Heart Association meeting, which showed that pravastatin reduced the incidence of fatal, non-fatal myocardial infarction by 1/3, relative reduction of 1/3. An absolute reduction was smaller at 1.5%, but undoubtedly the use of statins had reduced the incidence of fatal and non-fatal heart attacks.
And if I remember rightly, previously it had been shown that in people that had heart disease, statins were worthwhile, but this was the first study in a hypercholesterolemic patient without significant evidence of heart disease.
That's correct.
That's right.
That's what made it a landmark.
Could I just ask you, how many shares did you buy, Peter, before the results came out?
None.
I don't think anybody did actually.
But I do remember excessive secrecy until the results could be declared. Yeah.
But pravastatin must have sold millions and billions of, or the statins.
I don't think pravastatin became the leader, actually.
Did it not? What became the leader?
So. Well, I think rosuvastatin,
atorvastatin,
these drugs, I think sold better.
Yeah. So for that study, how did we recruit the West of Scotland? How did
volunteers?
Was that right?
There were many centres, and it was a superb study.
Yeah. West of Scotland was chosen because this was the highest incidence of coronary heart disease around the country.
Yeah.
And it was able, so that, I mean, it went out as Cumbernauld down into Ayrshire to recruit people. And it was a very well organised study.
But it was just volunteers.
Volunteers. Yeah, but there was a different approach to running the trial. Yeah. Evenings were organised where the volunteers and their partners could come along and be given a talk on diet, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And that encouraged the men to participate for the full 5 years. And they have been followed up, and the recent publications have shown that having taken a statin for the 5 years of the study, and maybe even having stopped it at the end of the trial, there was still benefit to be shown 15, 20 years later in these men.
There's no doubt at all that these meetings, I remember going out to Cumbernauld, Castlecarey, Scythe, that the partners coming along with the men, they were the ones that made sure that the men stuck to it, and with dietitians, and everybody was treated with the appropriate low cholesterol diet. And so that nobody was left without some management. But there were those that took pravastatin and those that took the placebo. No, as you say, it was an excellently organised study.
I mean, one spin-off from that, it's a wee bit self-centred, but those who participated in running the trial were invited to give talks worldwide. And a typical example might be a phone call on Monday morning saying, could you possibly give a talk in San Diego on Saturday? And say, well, okay, I'll do it. So you flew out to San Diego on the Friday, overnight in a hotel, give a talk on the Saturday morning, back to the airport on Saturday night, home to London Sunday, back into work on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Professor Shepherd travelled very widely in those times.
Just to
I mean,
get
so
it.
did many
Aye,
of
We
us.
had, it's a bit like it was to spread the word. It was like the gospel.
Exactly, well,
yeah,
yeah.
That's what they used to say if you wanted to get a meeting or catch Professor Shepherd, you had to organise it in an airport lounge, because that was the only way you could
I
get
can
it.
believe that. I can believe
John,
that.
looking back at your career as a nurse, has the role of the nurse changed much in cardiology?
I think it has. Just as you were talking, I was thinking in the 80s, the development of cardiac rehabilitation was coming to the fore, and I remember Liz Keith, don't know if you remember, which was really kind of nurse-led service. That was one of the early developments where nurses were taking a caseload and following up and managing patients post infarcts. I think just like many other subspecialties, the skill set of nurses has been kicked up because the service needs it, has required that. So there's been the development of advanced nurse practitioners in the same way that, at the emergency department or gastro and whatever, and even, nurse endoscopists. So that whole upskilling of nurses has permeated across all the specialties, and cardiology being no different.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And Peter, just to conclude, where do you think artificial intelligence is going to go in cardiology, and with your knowledge of electrocardiology, where are we with that?
Well, artificial intelligence is creeping in, certainly, to ECG interpretation. I think it will have a role to play in due course. At the minute, my criticism of AI in electrocardiography, for example, is that it is non-specific. Now, by that I mean it will report almost all of the cases of a specific abnormality, but at the same time, in people who do not have the abnormality, it will also report its presence. So it's not specific enough at the present time, in my understanding of what's happening. But I think in due course, it will improve. The other problem with AI, in many cases, if I use terrible words like convolutional neural networks, is that nobody quite knows how the interpretation is made. These networks are trained simply by inputting data that is from specific abnormalities, etc. And the network learns to classify the ECGs, but no one knows within that network really how this is done. The computer scientists will talk about explainability that says, well, maybe it's a QRS complex or something. So the interpretation will come out and it will say large heart, but it doesn't say large voltages in such and such a position of such and such a lead. So at the minute, it's coming through, but I think it will take many
My
years.
understanding is that now, for example, X-ray imaging and angiograms can be reported by AI.
Yes, I think one of the more successful areas has been radiology imaging, been interpreted by AI, from what I've read.
Peter, what major advances have there been in ECG work since you started? What's the current position?
Well, one huge change is the size of equipment required to interpret an ECG. I talked earlier about the penalty area in a football pitch was the size of the computer that we used initially. Now it's quite possible to have an ECG interpreted. Just one lead perhaps with two electrodes that can be used to put fingers on the electrodes, transmit the ECG into your mobile phone, and that can be then sent by phone for interpretation elsewhere, if not on the phone itself. Beyond that, we now have interpretation of a single lead on a watch. The Apple Watch, for example, and other types of wristwatches have the ability now to monitor your ECG. And so you can, if you find an abnormality here, you can report it to your cardiologist. So there's been a
single lead.
It's a single lead where one electrode, for example, could be the right first finger going on the crown of the watch, and the other side of the lead is actually the base of the wristwatch. So you have a potential difference between the right hand and the left hand, which is electrocardiologists will know is lead one of an ECG, normally with an electrode in the wrist, but just by doing finger on the right side of the crown of the watch, and the other electrode is the base of the watch, you can record an ECG.
What
And
about
it can be programmed to,
What about
to
the other
pick up
lead? In
abnormalities.
my day, you had all the leads, chest leads and limb leads, and that was as a pattern developed, say acute infarcts, and you saw changes in different leads and you could diagnose where the infarct was.
Sure.
How do you select the most important lead in this?
No, this is only a single lead for rhythm.
For
This
rhythm,
is
it's a
only for
rhythm
rhythm,
thing,
for
right.
rhythm analysis.
The
So
rhythm analysis.
all the other changes would be taken from the full
Thank you.
full 12 lead ECG.
And is that currently part of we say Apple, but other watches are available? Is that part of the current functionality, or is that?
Oh yes, that's available now. It's
that
been available for two to 3 years now from Apple,
Right.
and the other manufacturers have followed suit. But it is one lead, but it's basically designed, say, to detect a fast heart rate, if you use simple basic terms, fast heart rate, so on and so forth, or a very slow heart rate.
A stupid question, but is it used medically?
Yes, I did mention slow and fast heart rates, but the FDA have given Apple approval for the use of the watch to detect a heart rhythm irregularity known as atrial fibrillation, or AF for short. And even more recently, they've given Apple permission to use the watch to store the length of time that atrial fibrillation may occur within, say, even a 2-week period. Some patients have continuous atrial fibrillation, some patients have intermittent atrial fibrillation. So if you store the time of intermittent atrial fibrillation, you have a percentage time of how long atrial fibrillation occurred during that, say, a 2-week period, and that's known as the total burden for AF.
Are we asking patients to?
I think they've sold millions of these devices. And yes, they can be used medically. Yes.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, that was a most interesting and informative afternoon. I was pleased that even at my advanced age, it is possible for me to learn something new. And today has been no
You
exception.
can never be advanced.
Thank you very much for coming and giving us your time.
Thanks very much.
And
Thank
the
you.
friends
Thank
of
you for the
Glasgow
invitation.
Sudbury are very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.